where Jesus is sending out the 70. You'll recall that. The 70 went out to kind of prepare the way, if you will. And he told them, when you go, don't take too much stuff. Don't count on making a living while you're doing it. You're supposed to be teaching. So you do that, and you find someone who will let you stay in his house. And you do that. Jesus said, the laborer is worthy of his hire. Luke 10, verse 7. And that's the subject that Paul starts out addressing here in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. The laborer is worthy of his hire. And he starts out talking about farm labor. In verse 9, we'll pick up parts of the earlier verses as we go on. It is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it is treading the grain. He's talking about the ox, a laborer on the farm, if you will, the ox that moves that heavy grindstone around to grind out the wheat. Paul is citing here Deuteronomy 25, verse 4. Not muzzle the ox while it treads the grain. And it might make us think, well, who would do that? Well, Burton Kaufman said in his commentary on 1 Corinthians that many of the pagans would muzzle the ox while it was treading out the grain because they didn't want him to eat any of it. If the ox ate out of the grain, they had a little less, and they didn't want that. Is God concerned about animals? The answer is yes. Now, Paul says, is it oxen God is concerned about, or does he say it for our sake? Well, primarily he is saying it for their sake, the people's sake. But God does care about animals, and we are not to abuse them. And actually, I think that animal abuse is a felony, depending on how severe it is. So God does care about oxen who work on a farm. He cares about the men, that's in verse 10. The man who plows, the man who threshes, they do it in hope that something will come from it, that they will have some return for their labor. Paul wrote in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 6 that the farmer should have the first share of the crop. Now, he does clarify the farmer, the hard-working farmer. If the farmer doesn't do anything, he shouldn't expect much result. But the hard-working farmer should have the first share. A lot of us in here are retired. Some of you are not. You're still working. I hope you enjoy your job. I did. I had a good job, particularly when we lived in Anchorage, and I worked for Atlantic Richfield, and I worked with a number of really nice people. I liked that. But if they had stopped paying me, would I have continued to work? Well, probably not. I'd have found some people who would pay me. And a lot of you volunteer. Maybe you did it while you were still working. Now that you're retired, you do it even some more. It's an obligation on your time, but it's not a real strict obligation. The accountability is different. If you're a volunteer and you decide, I want to take a week off, I'm not going to go in, you just let them know. Well, they can't say, well, you're fired, because you can easily say, well, I quit, because you're not paid anyway. But those who plow and thresh should hope for a return. Farm labor. He goes on, verse 13. He talks about the workers in the temple, starting with the Levites, who did the more mundane things. And when the tabernacle was in place, the Levites were the ones who packed up all the stuff and carried it. That was their job. The Levites didn't have access to the sacrifices in the temple. They couldn't eat any of it. So they received of the tithes of Israel. We read that in Numbers chapter 18, verses 21 through 24. And out of those tithes, that 1/10 that came to them, they were supposed to give 1/10 in return to the tabernacle. They tithed from the tithe because they couldn't eat the sacrifices. And he talks about the priests. The priest ate from the offerings in the tabernacle and then later in the temple. They would have grain offerings. A small portion of that was burnt, and the rest was for the priests to eat, from Deuteronomy 6 and verse 16. The sin offering that a person might make was eaten by the priest who offered it, Deuteronomy 6:26. You had offerings of first fruits, and the priests received from that. William Barclay, in his Daily Study Bible, wrote that the average Jewish family didn't have meat very often. But the priests had meat regularly. They ate better than the average family. But they received these things from Deuteronomy 18 and verse 1. They received these things because they had no physical inheritance in the land. Instead of a physical inheritance, the Lord is their inheritance. Deuteronomy 18:2. The Lord is our inheritance, and it is far more valuable than anything physical. Any of the things that the priests might have enjoyed in their lives, or any of the things that we enjoy, we should rejoice that our names are written in heaven. So he talks about farm labor, animal or human. He talks about workers in the temple. And he comes down to workers in the church. Look at verse 14. Even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live by the gospel. Pay the preacher. If we pay the preacher, if we support the preacher, like the 70 that Jesus sent out to rely on a family for a roof over your head and food, it lets them devote more time to the work that they are trying to do. And so it's important that that support be adequate. It does not need to be lavish. Some of the television evangelists have private jets. Doesn't need to be that. But if your preacher is always wondering where his next meal is coming from, you need to pay him some more. Paul talks about that. I have that right. Look at verse 5. Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as also do the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas or Peter? Don't we have a right to that? And in verse 12, he talks about, if others are partakers of this right, are not we even more? But he didn't take advantage of it. When he talks about traveling with a wife, that doesn't address whether or not Paul had been married. Many commentators think that he had. And they also believe that when he became a Christian, his wife left him because she didn't want to grow up that way. But Paul had the right for support. He accepted it from the church in Philippi, but generally not from any congregation where he stayed for a period of time. He was supported from somewhere else, or he supported himself. He had rights that he gave up, in great contrast with many of the people that he was preaching with. As we support our preacher, we free him from worrying about where the next meal's coming from, whether or not he can pay the rent, whether he can support his family. And as we have a part in that, financially, it helps us to be aligned with the work that he's doing. We hear that in relation to missionaries. Missionaries go out, or missionaries locate, like the Manta team in Manta, Ecuador, which consumes close to $50,000 of our budget each year. We support them so they can teach. We have a part in their work. We're not there. We're not doing the teaching. We're not even going to the airport to get on a plane, to which I say thank God. I've done my share of flying, and I find it an absolute drudge now. And if I'm never on an airplane again, I don't care. But we can support them. And we support our ministers here with our giving. But if a church relies on its ministerial staff to do all of the work, that church is doomed to fail. It's probably doomed to die. Because we know people that our ministers don't know. We have contacts that they don't have. Philip preaches about that today. And all of us together have more combined time available and talent combined than our ministers do. And so if we are not doing our part, if we are relying on them, well, that's why we pay him. It isn't going to work. And the flip side of that is, in an active church, if the budget were used to pay all of the volunteers, there wouldn't be enough money to do it. It goes both ways. Ministers have a responsibility, and we provide for them financially so they can meet it. But we have responsibility too. The responsibility to share the gospel is given to all of us, not just to ministers. Paul had a right to be paid for preaching, but he didn't demand it. His reward, he said, was to preach for free. And it actually seems to be a matter of pride. And I use that in a nice term for Paul. Look at verse 15. But I've used none of these things, nor have I written these things about paying the preacher, that it should be done for me. For it would be better for me to die than that anyone should make my boasting void. Now, boasting, that's not a good term. It's a negative term. But what I read is that the word that is translated here for boasting, or maybe in your versions, glorying, could actually be translated rejoicing. Paul is saying, I don't want anyone to take my reason for rejoicing away from me. Remember when Jesus was talking about inviting people to your house? And he said, don't always invite your rich friends, and we can use that in just a relative sense. Don't always invite people who can just invite you back. And so you can keep a mark on your calendar. I invited him. He invited me. We're even. I'll invite him. He'll invite me. Jesus said, don't do that. Invite the people who can't pay you back. And in the same way, we should rejoice. We do rejoice when we help somebody out and we don't expect to get anything from it. Probably all of us have done that at some time. And it makes us feel good. We helped. We got nothing in return, except maybe thank you. And thank you means an awful lot. A lot of people aren't so good at saying thank you. Maybe we're among them. We need to get better at it when people do something for us. Paul had a reward because he preached willingly. And he goes on to say, if it's not willing, verse 17, I've been entrusted with a stewardship. It's my responsibility. You'll recall that the steward managed the assets of the owner. So the gospel had been given to Paul to preach. And he said, if it's my responsibility to do it, whether I really want to do it or not, it is my responsibility. He had a commission to preach. What happened to Paul on the Damascus Road when Jesus confronted him, that was not Paul's choice. Jesus impressed that upon him. Jesus told Paul, you are going to preach to the Gentiles. Paul didn't choose that. Jesus chose it for him. He had a responsibility to do it. We have a responsibility to do it. Luke 17 and verse 10 is not part of a parable. It is a teaching from Jesus, where he said, when you have done everything that's been assigned to you, you should say, we are unprofitable servants. We have only done that which was our duty to do. It is our duty to spread the gospel. Should we find joy in it? Absolutely. But it is our responsibility anyway. And so Paul didn't take advantage of this right that he had to be compensated. But he supported himself. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 8 and 9, he supported himself while he was preaching at Thessalonica so that he wouldn't be an obligation, so that he would be an example. And that leads us to a verse that we should know. 2 Thessalonians 3:10. If a man will not work, what should he not do? Eat. If we are unwilling to support ourselves, Paul is saying, and it's got a lot of application to the United States in 2021. If we're not willing to support ourselves, don't expect anybody else to do it. You have no obligation to them at all. For people who can't work, that's one thing. People who won't work is entirely another. So he wanted to serve as an example to them. And how did he support himself? Well, he worked with canvas. He was a tent maker. He probably also made sails for ships. That would have been hard work. It was manual work. And the Greeks did not look with favor on manual work. It was low status. So you had a low status job if you made tents. Just like maybe you have a low status job if you're a ditch digger or a garbage collector or a housekeeper in a hotel. But all of those things need to be done. And you've heard the expression, what is honest is honorable. That's true. But Paul didn't want people to think, I am preaching for the money. I'm not in it for money. Well, he got criticized for that. Some people said, well, the fact that you don't take money for your preaching means that you really aren't an apostle. I mentioned William Barclay earlier. Some people made fun of Socrates and Plato, two of the most brilliant men who ever lived, because they didn't accept money for their teaching. If they were really good teachers, they would have accepted pay. They did it for free. No one's work, no volunteer's work should be discounted just because they aren't paid. And Paul's work should not have been discounted by the Corinthian church just because he didn't take money from them. Because whether it was by choice or by compulsion, he had to preach. Listen to the words of Jeremiah in Jeremiah 20 and verse 9. Just one verse, you don't even need to turn there. Then I said, I will not make mention of him, nor speak any more in his name, but his word was in my heart like a burning fire, shut up in my bones. I was weary of holding it back, and I could not. Jeremiah preached to a people who didn't want to hear him. They made life very hard for him. It was hard for him to proclaim the words of God because whenever he did, he just got in trouble. So he tried to say, I'm just not going to. But the word just welled up inside. He couldn't hold back. He couldn't keep silent. And Paul, from Romans 1 and verse 14, I am indebted to both Jews and Gentiles. I am indebted to them to preach the word of God to them. Just as I was indebted to you, Corinthians, and I preach to you. If I'm not an apostle to others, this is verse 2, yet doubtless I am to you. You're the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. I preached to you, you accepted it. Your seal, confirming the message. Paul was an apostle, one born out of due time, as he described it, because he didn't walk with Jesus when Jesus was walking around on earth, but he saw him on the Damascus Road, and that's what enabled him to be an apostle. He had seen, and also he was an effective messenger of the gospel. He converted so many people because he knew how to approach them. He became all things to all men, so that I might by all means save some. That's verse 22. To the Jews, he became like the Jews. Well, he refers back to his past, Philippians 3 and verse 6. Concerning the righteousness found in the law, I'm blameless. He followed the law very carefully. We see it in what he did with Timothy, Acts chapter 16 at Lystra. Timothy's mother was a Jew, his father was not. Paul was going to be working, some with Jews, some with Gentiles, and he knew how the Jews would react to Timothy as an uncircumcised man. So he had Timothy circumcised. In Acts chapter 21, Paul observed a vow, or he supported men who had taken a vow. He wasn't obligated, but he did it. We see it in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 about eating food that had been offered to idols. And he would eat or he would not eat, depending upon the audience, because he didn't want to offend anyone. He was careful. To the Jews, I became as a Jew. To those without law, verse 23 or 21, I became as without law. Timothy was circumcised. Titus was not circumcised. Titus' parents, mother, father, were Gentiles. No need. People pressured Paul. Have him circumcised. No, I'm not, because it is not necessary. With the Gentiles, Paul did not act as one subject to the law of Moses, but he always acted as one subject to the law of Christ. To the weak, I became as weak. Almost certainly referring to chapter 8 again, meat offered to idols. But he never compromised the truth in what he did. Paul didn't use the scriptures to beat people over the head, but he held closely to them. And as you know from Paul's labors, when he went to a new place, he normally went first to the synagogue, because there he found people who believed in the same God that he did, who had a similar heritage to his. He began with common ground. You have friends in all manner of denominations. Like I said earlier, you know people that Philip and Dwight and other ministers don't know. You can reach out to them. And if they are active, or they're not very active, in their denomination, what are they going to believe about God? Probably the same as you do. What are they going to believe about the importance of faith? Very important. What are they going to believe about trying to live a good life and repenting when you fail? Same as you do. Where are they probably going to disagree with you? Baptism by immersion for the forgiveness of sins. Okay? So, when you start out, I'm glad to meet you, Fred. Have you been baptized by immersion for the forgiveness of your sins? Not a good starting point. You can get to that, but you don't have to get to it in the first 5 minutes. That's the mistake. Paul began on common ground, and he worked from there. Because Paul said, this is starting in verse 24, we are all in a race. Let's read. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we an imperishable. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. In a race, in the Olympics or a junior high track meet, there's one winner. But in the Christian race, everybody can win. God wants everyone to be saved, to come to a knowledge of the truth, 1 Timothy 2 and verse 4. But it's only through the knowledge of that truth, through the adherence to that truth, that they can be saved. Paul likes these athletic analogies. He said in 2 Timothy 2 and verse 5 that an athlete must compete according to the rules. Well, you remember that fairly recent scandal about Deflategate. I think that's what they called it. When the New England Patriots may have deflated footballs a little bit to make them easier to catch. Tom Brady was involved in that, but Tom Brady being Tom Brady, there were no real ramifications from it. We hear from Animal Farm that all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. That was one of the maxims. Well, in the same way, all athletes are equal, but Tom Brady is above others. And so he was not severely rebuked. That did not apply to a woman named Rosa Ruiz. Some of you would have heard of Rosa Ruiz. This was in the 1980 Boston Marathon. She was present at the start. She was also present on the subway. And a half mile from the finish, she rejoined the race. And lo and behold, she came in first for the women in a time that was more than 20 minutes better than her first time. She ran the last half mile and was proclaimed the winner. That lasted for 8 days, and she was no longer proclaimed the winner, and the second place winner became the winner. Rosa Ruiz was a deceiver. It was a habit. 2 years later, 1982, she was arrested for embezzling $60,000 from her employer. 1983, she was part of a cocaine ring. She did not compete according to the rules. But she was competing for a prize, money, yes, but it wouldn't last. The crown that awaits us, Paul said in verse 25, that Peter said in 1 Peter 1 and verse 4, is imperishable. People in Corinth were familiar with those crowns. Corinth was the host of the Isthmian Games. It was second only to the Olympics at that time. The training period, according to the New Bible Commentary, was 10 months. For Olympic athletes today, they would think, 10 months? Boy, that's the final stretch only. Olympic athletes today prepare for it through their whole life until the time of the competition. And you look at those, particularly those tiny women that are the gymnasts who are 17 or 18, have broken down a lot of their joints because they've been doing it for a dozen years already. No, it's an ongoing thing. But in the Isthmian Games, they competed for a wreath, dried out quickly, looked like an old dead plant. We are competing for a imperishable prize, and we will only win it with self-control, with persevering, with completing the course. Or as James says, for those who have stood the test. And Paul wanted to make sure that he stood the test, that he would not be disqualified or rejected or reprobate, depending upon your version. And to do that, he wanted to serve Christ faithfully, and he wanted to resist the sin that was always trying to get hold of him. And so he said in verse 27, I discipline my body. Old King James says, I buffet my body. That word for buffet or keep under really meant to bruise under the eyes, like a punch. I punch my body to make sure that I keep my focus. Adam Clarke addressed that. Shall we pretend to be wiser than the apostle and say that we may gain the crown, though we neither fight the good fight nor finish the course? Well, the answer is obvious. It's no. Paul talks about fighting the air, shadowboxing. It's worthwhile in training, but in an actual event, it's not really very effective. He did not want to be reprobate. And that word that is translated reprobate or disqualified in Hebrews 6 and verse 8 is translated as rejected. Paul is saying the crown is there, but you have to finish the race to get the crown. Next week, we will cover the first 13 verses of chapter 10.